Picture this. It's a cold Saturday evening in winter, across Britain's east coast. Children are being kissed goodnight, families are settling by the fire, and coastal towns are tucked up safe and warm. It's been a blustery winter day, but nothing unusual for the season. But something was brewing out at sea. That night in Jaywick, 37 people died in a single night. That's 5% of the entire population simply wiped out. On Canvey Island, an entire family was found days later, their birthday cake still untouched on the table. One Norfolk survivor watched the sea rise over 5 feet inside his home in just 15 minutes. This wasn't the Titanic. This wasn't a war. This was Britain, 1953, and 307 people died in their own beds because the sea came calling in the middle of the night. If your family has roots along the East Coast, 31st January 1953 still sends a shiver through them. This story isn't ancient history. It's the reason your parents never trusted calm seas, and you're about to discover why. Now, before we dive into that terrible night, you need to understand something. This isn't just another disaster story. This is the event that changed how Britain thinks about weather, floods, and the sea itself. Every time you check your phone for weather warnings, every time you see flood barriers along the Thames, every time coastal communities prepare for storms, you're seeing the legacy of what happened in 1953. Get this story wrong, and you miss the moment Britain learned to fear the sea. Because here's what most people don't realise. This disaster created Britain's first proper storm tide warning service. It forced us to build the Thames Barrier, completed in 1982. It's why the Dutch spent billions on flood defences that protect millions today. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to that Saturday night when Britain was caught completely off guard. Why this happened? Let me paint you a picture of what was building in the North Sea. A combination of high spring tide and a severe European windstorm was creating the perfect storm. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to pour a bucket of water through a funnel, but the funnel keeps getting narrower. That's exactly what was happening as millions of tons of North Sea water got squeezed down towards the English Channel. But here's what nobody tells you about weather in the 1950s. There was no 24-hour weather service, no mobile phone alerts, no internet warnings. What was actually happening? The UK Meteorological Office had issued warnings on Friday 30th about a severe storm developing, with further warnings on Saturday morning. But these warnings never reached the people who needed them most. Radio stations didn't broadcast at night. Many coastal communities had no direct line to weather services. The storm surge was recorded at 5.6 metres, that's 18 feet, at its peak. To put that in perspective, that's higher than most British bungalows. The sea wasn't just overflowing, it was towering above the land. The surge hit Hunstanton at 5:45 p.m, then raced south like a liquid avalanche. It reached Spurn Head in Yorkshire at 4 p.m, then swept down the entire east coast. Each town had just minutes to react. This wasn't like floods you see in films, where water rises slowly and people have time to evacuate. Survivors reported that it took less than 15 minutes from the first trickle to complete devastation. Picture being woken from deep sleep by the sound of your floorboards creaking, but it's not the house settling. It's ice-cold seawater, already halfway up your bedroom door. That's exactly what thousands of families experienced that night. But here's what makes this story even more tragic. And this might shock you. The deadliest flooding didn't come from the sea crashing over coastal walls as you might expect. In places like Felixstowe, the devastation came from behind, as the surge smashed river walls in 7 places. Families went to sleep thinking they were safe inland, only to wake up with the North Sea in their bedrooms. The true horror of that night wasn't just in how the water arrived, it was in the price Britain paid for being unprepared. So why the death toll was so high? You see, in 1953, Britain was still rebuilding after the war. Sea defences were designed to keep invading armies out, not invading seas. Many coastal areas had prefabricated buildings, basically wooden huts, housing families in low-lying areas. These weren't proper houses. They were temporary structures that became permanent homes because of the post-war housing crisis. When the sea came calling, they stood no chance. And what the human cost actually was. Let me give you the numbers that changed Britain forever. 307 people died in England, 19 in Scotland. But here's the statistic that really hits home. 58 deaths occurred on Canvey Island alone. That's an entire community devastated in one night. If you're over 60 and your family lived on the East Coast, stop for a moment. Think about your parents' generation. The chances are they knew someone who was affected that night. In Meadow Way, Esther and James had gathered with their son and daughter to celebrate Esther's 89th birthday on February 1st. The sea engulfed their home in the night, and all four drowned. When police found them 3 days later, that birthday cake still sat untouched on the kitchen table. But here's a story that shows the other side of human nature. 12 hours after the disaster struck Canvey, a Dutch boatman and a Scottish welder found an 8-week-old baby whose parents had drowned. Baby Linda's survival became a symbol of hope in the darkest of times. For decades, we assumed people drowned, but medical records tell a different story. Many victims actually died from hypothermia, not drowning, as they clung to rooftops in sub-zero temperatures for hours, waiting for rescues that came too late. Imagine clinging to a roof tile in January, soaked to the bone, while hurricane-force winds cut through you like knives. That's how Britain lost over 300 souls in a single night. For years, we celebrated the community spirit and resilience of that night. But historians now argue that these feel-good stories actually masked fundamental government failures in flood preparedness and warning systems. Yes, communities showed incredible bravery, but they shouldn't have been put in that position in the first place. Yet, from this tragedy emerged something quintessentially British: the quiet determination to make sure it could never happen again. Within hours of the disaster, something extraordinary happened. The Blitz spirit kicked in, with soup kitchens and temporary shelters appearing across the affected areas. But this wasn't just local communities helping themselves. The whole world took notice. Aid came from Canada, Finland, and even school children in Kuwait sent money. Think about that for a moment. Children on the other side of the world heard about British families losing everything, and they emptied their pocket money to help. The months and years after the disaster led directly to the creation of Britain's storm tide warning service and eventually the Thames Barrier. But the Dutch response was even more dramatic. They launched the Delta Works, a massive flood defence system designed to reduce flooding risk to once every 4,000 years. It's been called one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. To put that into perspective, the Dutch spent the equivalent of £20 billion in today's money protecting themselves from future floods. That's like building 2 entire HS2 railway lines just for flood defence. To complicate matters, recent historians argue that all the talk of British resilience and community spirit actually helped the government avoid taking responsibility for the disaster. Yes, ordinary people showed extraordinary courage, but they were let down by systems that should have protected them. Think about it this way. We celebrate the heroes who rowed boats through hurricane winds to save their neighbours. But we should also ask why those neighbours needed saving in the first place. Why weren't there proper warnings? Why weren't coastal defences adequate? Which brings us to the question that haunts every coastal family today. Could it happen again? Here's something that might keep you awake at night. The Thames Barrier, completed in 1982, is already scheduled to be replaced by 2060 as sea levels continue rising. That £1 billion flood defence that protects London? It's already becoming outdated. Let me give you some numbers that tell the real story. During Storm Eunice in 2022, 1.4 million homes lost power at the peak. That's more disruption than 1953. But here's the crucial difference. Far fewer people died, thanks to modern weather warnings and better preparedness. And here's what the experts won't tell you directly. We're not necessarily safer, we're just better warned. Sea levels are rising, and storm patterns are changing. The storm that created the 1953 disaster is actually becoming more likely, not less. The 1953 disaster was officially the first time the British government acknowledged changing weather patterns as a policy concern. That makes 1953 Britain's first climate change wake-up call, 70 years before most people had even heard the term global warming. Think about this. Your grandparents lived through the night that taught Britain to respect the power of weather. Now your grandchildren might face storms that make 1953 look mild by comparison. Modern flood defences are designed to protect against events expected once every 200 to 1,000 years. That sounds reassuring, doesn't it? But 1953 was also supposed to be a once-in-a-thousand-year event. The uncomfortable truth is this. Nature doesn't read our statistical models. For those who lived through 1953, the question isn't whether another great surge will come. It's whether your children and grandchildren will be ready when it does. Because make no mistake, it's not a matter of if, but when. So there you have it, the night that changed Britain forever. From a small weather system in the Atlantic to 307 lives lost, 24,000 homes destroyed, and a complete rethinking of how we live with the sea. If your family lived through that night, or if you've walked past those watermarks still visible on old coastal buildings, you're part of this story. I want you to share your memories in the comments below. Did your parents or grandparents ever talk about the Great Flood? What stories were passed down in your family? These weren't just statistics. Those 307 people who died were your neighbours, your teachers, your shopkeepers. They were ordinary people, living ordinary lives until the sea came calling. And here's why sharing these stories matters. The generation that lived through 1953 won't be with us much longer. Their memories, their lessons, their hard-won wisdom about respecting the sea, all of that disappears unless we keep telling their story. Subscribe for more forgotten chapters of British history that shaped who we are today. Hit that notification bell because next week we're exploring another disaster that taught Britain a lesson it never forgot. Remember, understanding our past disasters isn't about dwelling on tragedy. It's about making sure we're prepared for whatever the future brings. Because if 1953 taught us anything, it's that nature always bats last. And sometimes it plays to win.